My name is Abby. I am 21 years old, and I am currently a third-year sociology student serving as a junior research intern at the Institute for Civic Harmony, a nonprofit that prides itself on its progressive workplace culture. To the untrained eye, this office is a sanctuary of equality, filled with standing desks, ergonomic chairs, and a kitchen stocked with fair trade almond milk. To me, however, it is a laboratory, a petri dish where I observe the microscopic movements of the patriarchy and the relentless extraction of emotional labor. My life is not lived, it is audited. Every interaction is a transaction, every smile a potential submission, and every casual conversation a data point in my ongoing study of the systemic rot that defines the modern male-female dynamic. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning, delivered via an all-staff email with a subject line that made my skin crawl: mandatory fun, team-building extravaganza. The sender was Arthur Henderson, the director of operations. Arthur is a man who thinks his lack of a tie makes him an ally. He wears expensive sneakers to the office and uses words like synergy and vibe to mask the fact that he is the ultimate arbiter of a hierarchy he pretends doesn't exist. The email informed us that, in order to celebrate our recent wins, the entire staff was required to attend an evening of bowling and interactive dining at a venue called the Strike Zone this Friday, starting at 6 p.m. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keys. I immediately began calculating the emotional labor cost. Friday night is my time I use to decompress from the intellectual fatigue of navigating a world designed to ignore my agency. By mandating fun, Arthur wasn't just asking for my time, he was colonizing my private life. He was demanding that I perform a specific version of myself, the team player, the cheerful intern, under the guise of benevolence. It was a classic display of benevolent sexism, the assumption that because he was providing a treat, we owed him our presence and our enthusiasm. "Are you going?" Sarah asked, leaning over the Lowition of our shared cubicle. Sarah is 24, a full-time program coordinator, and, unfortunately, a primary victim of internalized compliance. She smiles too much. She apologizes for things that aren't her fault. She is the human equivalent of a live, laugh, love sign. "I don't see that I have a choice, Sarah," I replied, my voice flat, devoid of the performative lilt she expected. The email says mandatory. It's a fascinating linguistic choice, don't you think? To pair a word signifying coercion with a word signifying enjoyment. It's the neoliberal paradox in a nutshell. You are forced to be happy for the sake of the institution's metrics. Sarah blinked, her smile faltering. "I mean, it's just bowling, Abby. And free pizza." "There is no such thing as free pizza, Sarah," I said, turning back to my monitor. "The pizza is a bribe. We pay for it with our silence, our compliance, and the 3 hours of our lives we will never get back. We are the product being sold to the board of directors as high morale." I spent the rest of the day observing the office's reaction. The men, Marcus, Julian, and David, were already discussing their bowling averages. They saw the event as a literal playground, an opportunity to project physical dominance in a non-threatening environment. They didn't consider the childcare arrangements the women were frantically making over the phone. They didn't consider the grooming gap, the extra 45 minutes women would spend preparing to look casually professional, while the men simply showed up in the same shirts they'd worn all day. As a sociological observer, I began drafting my daily patriarchy report in a private document. Point 1. Spatial colonization. Marcus was currently sitting at his desk with his legs spread so wide he was encroaching on Julian's space. Yet Julian said nothing because their shared masculine privilege creates a mutual understanding of entitlement to space. Point 2. The expectation of care. I watched Arthur ask Maya, the head of our research dement and the most brilliant mind in the building, if she would mind rounding up the headcount and organizing the ride shares. He didn't ask Marcus. He asked Maya, instinctively reaching for the woman to handle the logistical and emotional heavy lifting of the group's cohesion. Friday arrived like a slow-motion train wreck. By 5:30 p.m., the office was a hive of forced excitement. I had chosen my armor carefully, a high-collared black turtleneck and trousers. No jewelry. No makeup. My appearance was a refusal to be aestheticized for the male gaze. When we arrived at the strike zone, the sensory assault was immediate. Neon lights, the crash of pins, and the smell of cheap grease, it was a temple to lowbrow consumerism. Arthur was there, already holding a beer, beckoning us over like a shepherd who had forgotten he was also the butcher. "Abby, glad you made it. Let's see that competitive spirit." He reached out to pat my shoulder, a gesture of fatherly encouragement that I avoided by pivoting slightly to pick up a pair of bowling shoes. "I'm here to observe the social dynamics of forced socialization, Arthur," I said. "Competitiveness is a byproduct of toxic individualist structures. I'll be over there." I sat on the plastic bench, watching the farce unfold. The teams were randomly assigned, but I noticed the subtle clustering. The women were grouped in ways that ensured they would be the ones keeping score, the ones cheering the loudest, the ones mediating the minor tensions that arose when Marcus inevitably became too aggressive with his throws. Maya, who should have been at home finishing her grant proposal or resting her intellect, was instead laughing at one of Arthur's mediocre jokes. I could see the tightness around her eyes, the mask of the professional woman. She was performing the required fun because she knew that her career advancement depended not just on her brilliance, but on her likability. Her likability was the tax she paid to exist in a space controlled by men like Arthur. I decided to conduct a few stress tests of the environment. When Marcus came over, grinning after a strike, and held up his hand for a high five, I simply looked at his hand and then back at my notebook. "What, no love for the strike?" he asked, his grin turning into a confused grimace. "The physical gesture of a high five is a performative validation of masculine ego," I said calmly. "I don't feel the need to participate in the reinforcement of your self-worth through physical contact." Marcus let his hand drop. "Wow, okay. It's just a game, Abby. You're being a bit much, don't you think?" A bit much is the phrase men use when a woman refuses to provide the emotional labor they feel entitled to, I replied. "You're experiencing a momentary lapse in external validation, and you're coding it as a personal attack. That's a fascinating insight into your fragility." He walked away, muttering "weirdo" under his breath. I noted it down. Subject reacts with defensive labeling when denied unearned emotional support. As the night wore on, the fun began to fray at the edges. Julian, one of our best analysts and a man who usually kept to himself, looked increasingly miserable. He was a father of two, and I knew from overheard conversations that Hisner was struggling with a newborn. He shouldn't have been here. He should have been at home providing the domestic labor he owed his family. But Arthur was hovering, encouraging him to stay for one more round. "You look exhausted, Julian," I said, sliding next to him as he sat staring at a plate of cold wings. "I am, Abby. I'm beat. But Arthur says this is important for team unity. Apparently, if we don't throw heavy balls at pins together, we can't write reports together." "It's a control mechanism," I whispered. "He's testing your loyalty. He wants to see if you value his vision more than your own boundaries. Every minute you stay here is a minute you're signaling that your personal life is secondary to the Institute's brand." Julian looked at me, a flicker of realization in his eyes. "I never thought of it that way. I just thought I was being a good sport." "Good sport is the language of the oppressor," I said. "It's how they get you to police yourself." I saw the seed planted. Throughout the evening, I moved through the room like a ghost, or perhaps a surgeon, cutting through the layers of fun to reveal the exhaustion underneath. I spoke to Sarah about the opportunity cost of the evening. I spoke to Maya about the invisible burden of organizing the carpools. I didn't tell them what to do. I simply provided the theoretical framework they needed to understand their own resentment. The climax of the evening occurred at 8:30 p.m. Arthur stood up on a chair, clinking a glass to get everyone's attention. "Hey team, listen up. I know we're all having a blast, so I've decided, since we're such a great group, that we're going to make this a monthly thing. First Friday fun days. Who's in?" The silence that followed was exquisite. It was a vacuum of unperformed enthusiasm. Sarah looked at her feet. Marcus looked at Arthur, waiting for someone else to cheer. But the silence held. "Come on." Arthur laughed, though it sounded strained. "Maya? You're in, right? You're the life of they." Maya stood up. She didn't smile. The mask had finally slipped. Actually, Arthur, I'm not. In fact, I've been thinking about the team unity you keep mentioning. If we were truly a unified team, you would respect that we have lives outside these four walls. This isn't fun for me. It's an extension of my workday for which I am not being compensated. And quite frankly, I'm tired. Arthur's face turned a shade of pink that matched the neon strike sign behind him. Maya, it's just a team-building exercise. It's an intrusion, Julian added, standing up beside her. I should be at home with my kids. I'm staying here because I'm afraid of how it will look if I leave. That's not a vibe, Arthur. That's a hostage situation. The room erupted not in cheers, but in a chaotic outpouring of long-suppressed grievances. The fun had been dismantled. I sat back, watching the structure collapse with the cold satisfaction of an architect watching a faulty building succumb to gravity. The following Monday, the atmosphere at the Institute for Civic Harmony was different. It was quiet. The performative cheerfulness was gone, replaced by a tense, professional distance. By noon, the news had broken. Maya and Julian had both handed in their resignations. They were the two most productive members of the staff, the ones who actually did the work that kept the Institute funded. Arthur spent the day locked in his office. He didn't come out to offer synergy. He didn't ask anyone about their vibe. He looked through the glass walls of his office like a man who had tried to pet a dog and realized too late it was a wolf. I sat at my desk, typing up my final report for my internship supervisor at the university. I had documented everything. The rise and fall of the Mandatory Fun initiative was a perfect case study in the failure of neoliberal management to account for the growing consciousness of emotional labor. Sarah came by my desk, her eyes red. She had been crying. They're really gone, Abby. Maya and Julian. Everything's going to be so much harder now. Why did you have to say those things to them? Why couldn't you just let us have one night? I looked at Sarah, feeling a flicker of pity that I quickly extinguished with a mental recitation of radical theory. I didn't do anything, Sarah. I simply provided them with the tools to see their own exploitation. If the truth destroyed your fun, then your fun was built on a lie. You're grieving for a facade. You're so cold, she whispered. Do you even care that the team is falling, eh? Do you care about anything other than your categories? I care about the truth, I said. And the truth is that team is a euphemism for a collective of individuals whose labor is being harvested. I've reached a level of clarity that you find uncomfortable. That's not my burden to carry, it's yours. Sarah walked away, and I knew she wouldn't speak to me again unless she absolutely had to. Within a week, she had moved her desk to the other side of the office. The other interns stopped inviting me to lunch. Even Marcus avoided eye contact. I was an island of ethical purity in a sea of unconscious compliance. By the end of the month, the Institute was a ghost town. Arthur had been reassigned by the board after the loss of the two key staff members led to the collapse of a major grant. The new interim director was a woman who spoke in even more guarded, corporate tones, but she didn't mandate bowling. She didn't mandate anything. She was a vacuum of leadership, terrified of triggering another emancipation event. I sat in my ament on a Friday night, the glow of my laptop the only light in the room. I was alone. My phone sat silent on the desk. I had unfollowed most of my classmates on social media because their posts were filled with problematic content, unironic photos of them at brunch, dissipating in the very consumerist rituals I had spent my life deconstructing. I had even stopped talking to my mother after she suggested that I lighten up and maybe try to see the good in people. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. I was 21, I was brilliant, and I was entirely, perfectly alone. I had audited my life so thoroughly that there was nothing left but the ledger. I had tested everyone around me, and they had all failed. They were all compromised, all impure, all unwilling to live up to the rigorous ethical standards I had set. I thought about Maya and Julian. They had escaped Arthur, yes, but they hadn't escaped the system. They had simply moved to other jobs, other offices, where they would undoubtedly perform other forms of labor. They had used my words to find a temporary freedom, but they hadn't followed me into the light of total awareness. They were still dissipating. I opened a new document and began to type. The isolation of the vanguard, a sociological analysis of ethical superiority. My aimant was decorated exactly as it should be. The books were arranged by theory. The furniture was ethically sourced. The air was filtered and pure. There was no benevolent sexism here. There was no unpaid emotional labor. There was no one to mansplain, no one to microaggress, no one to demand a smile. It was the perfect environment. It was sterile. It was quiet. It was a prison of my own making, built with the bricks of my own intelligence and the mortar of my own judgment. I had won. I had proven everyone wrong. I had exposed the flaws in the design of human connection. I reached for my tea, fair trade, organic, steeped for exactly 4 minutes. As I took a sip, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I had laughed. Not a cynical, analytical laugh, but a real one. I searched my memory, scanning my data points, but I found nothing. Laughter, I decided, was likely just a physiological response to the temporary relief of systemic pressure. It wasn't necessary. I looked back at the screen. The cursor blinked, a steady, rhythmic pulse in the dark. It was the only thing in the room that didn't require me to judge it. I continued to type, my fingers moving across the keys with the precision of a machine, documenting my own solitude as the ultimate political achievement. I was Abby. I was 21. I was a student of the world, and I was the only one left in the classroom. The silence of the office, the silence of my friends, the silence of my life, it wasn't a void. It was a statement. I had reached the end of the theory, and there, in the cold, clear light of my own making, I found that there was no one else who could survive the atmosphere I had created. I was the radical auditor, and I had finally audited myself into non-existence. I looked at the clock. It was Friday night. Somewhere, people were bowling. Somewhere, people were performing fun and performing friendship and performing love. They were failing, of course. They were being exploited. They were being problematic. But they were together. I turned away from the window and focused on the screen. The personal is political, I reminded myself. And if my person was now entirely alone, it simply meant that my politics were absolute. I hit save and watched the file upload to the cloud, a single, perfect spark of data in an infinite, messy, and irredeemable world. I sat there for a long time, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes, waiting for a notification that would never come, for a message from someone I hadn't already discarded. I was independent. I was empowered. I was right. And as the city lights twinkled outside my window, I realized that right was the loneliest thing a person could be. The next morning, I returned to the office. It was Saturday, and the building was mostly empty, but as an intern, I had keycard access. I liked the office when it was silent. I liked the way the empty desks looked rows of abandoned potential. I walked past Marcus's desk, noticing a small photo he had left behind of his dog. I felt a momentary impulse to smile, but I suppressed it. A dog was just a captive animal used for emotional regulation. I sat at my desk and opened the shared drive. I began to organize the files Maya had left behind. She was gone, and the institute was failing, but the data remained. The data was the only thing that was honest. I worked for hours, lost in the purity of the numbers and the cold comfort of the sociological framework. At one point, the new interim director, a woman named MS. Sterling, walked by. She stopped and looked at me, her expression unreadable. "You're still here, Abby?" she asked. "On a Saturday? Labor doesn't stop just because the clock does, MS. Sterling, I replied without looking up. I'm ensuring the intellectual integrity of the research remains intact after the recent disruptions. She sighed, a sound of profound weariness. You know, Abby, you're a very bright young woman. But there's more to social progress than just identifying problems. You have to be able to build something, too. And you can't build anything alone. Building implies compromise, I said. And compromise is just another word for the erosion of principles. I prefer to remain structurally sound. She didn't argue. She just shook her head and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the hollowed-out space of the Atlas Institute for Social Progress. I listened until the sound faded completely. I was 21. I was a sociology student. I was an intern. And I was the last person left in the laboratory. I picked up my pen and began to grade the world's performance. It was a failing grade across the board, and as the only one left to record it, I felt a grim, solitary sense of duty. The ledger of emotional labor was finally balanced, but there was no one left to sign the bottom of the page. I spent the rest of the afternoon drafting a new proposal for the university. I titled it The Architecture of the Void: Why Purity is the Ultimate Resistance. In it, I argued that the only way to truly escape the patriarchal and neoliberal structures of the modern world was to systematically sever every tie that required a compromise of the self. I wrote about the liberation of isolation and the sovereignty of the single voice. As I wrote, I felt a sense of clarity that was almost transcendental. I was no longer a participant in the messy, flawed world of human emotion. I was an observer, elevated above the fray by the sheer weight of my own intellectual rigor. I didn't need the mandatory fun of Arthur Henderson. I didn't need the performative friendship of Sarah. I didn't even need the brilliance of Maya. I was the only data point that mattered. When I finally left the office, the sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. I walked through the city, my eyes scanning the crowds for microaggressions, for displays of benevolent sexism, for the silent extraction of labor. I saw them everywhere. I saw it in the way a man held a door for a woman, his posture a subtle assertion of dominance. I saw it in the way a girl laughed at her boyfriend's joke, her eyes scanning the room for social approval. I saw it all, and I felt nothing but the cool, distant satisfaction of being right. I reached my aimant, locked the 3 deadbolts on the door, and sat in the center of my perfectly curated life. I was 21. I was Abby. And I was free. I was as free as a stone at the bottom of a well, untouched, unchanging, and utterly, magnificently alone. I opened my laptop one last time and looked at the daily patriarchy report. I added a final entry. Asterisk conclusion: the only way to win the game is to refuse to play. The price of refusal is everything. The reward of refusal is the truth. Asterisk. I closed the laptop. The room went dark. I sat in the silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in a world that I had finally, successfully, brought to heel. I had won the war of emotional labor by declaring bankruptcy. There was no more labor to give, and no one left to receive it. I was the master of my own sterile universe, and as I closed my eyes, I knew that tomorrow, I would wake up and do it all again, auditing the void until there was nothing left to find.